There is something deeply unsettling about the human mind, something that science has struggled to understand for centuries. What happens when fear, stress, and social pressure collide in just the right way to make entire communities believe the impossible, see the invisible, or fall victim to illnesses that don't actually exist? Tonight, we explore some of history's most baffling cases of mass hysteria, events that swept through towns, schools, and entire nations, leaving behind nothing but questions that remain unanswered to this day. It was the summer of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, a bustling medieval hub nestled along the Rhine River in what was then the Holy Roman Empire and is now modern-day France. The narrow cobblestone streets wound between half-timbered houses where merchants, craftsmen, and laborers went about their daily lives. July had arrived with a punishing heat wave, the kind that made the air feel thick and oppressive, and the citizens of Strasbourg were already worn thin. The previous years had brought nothing but suffering to this corner of Europe. Failed harvests had left families starving. Smallpox and syphilis swept through the crowded streets. Floods had destroyed homes and livelihoods, and lurking in the collective memory was the ever-present specter of the bubonic plague, which had devastated the region decades earlier and could return at any moment. Against this backdrop of misery and uncertainty, something strange began to unfold on July 14th. A woman known to history only as Frau Trophäa stepped outside her home onto the narrow street and began to dance. There was no music playing, no celebration underway, and no apparent reason for her movements. She simply danced, her body twisting and gyrating in a frenzied, convulsive manner that seemed beyond her control. Her husband pleaded with her to stop, but she ignored him. Neighbors gathered to watch in confusion as this woman continued her bizarre performance throughout the day and into the night. By the time darkness fell, Frau Trophäa was still dancing. Her feet were swollen and bloody, her body trembling with exhaustion, yet she could not or would not stop. She collapsed eventually, only to resume her compulsive movements after a brief rest. This pattern continued for days. Her husband, desperate and confused, had no idea what was happening to his wife. The local physicians were equally baffled. What could possibly possess a woman to dance herself to the point of physical collapse? And then something even more disturbing happened. Others joined her. By the end of the first week, more than 30 people in Strasbourg had been seized by the same uncontrollable urge to dance. They danced in the streets, in the market squares, wherever they happened to be when the compulsion took hold of them. None of them appeared to be enjoying themselves. Their faces were contorted with expressions that witnesses described as somewhere between ecstasy and agony. They screamed and cried out as they moved, their limbs flailing wildly as if controlled by some invisible puppeteer. Within a month, the number had swollen to approximately 400 people. The city was gripped by what can only be described as a plague of dancing. Some accounts from the time claim that dancers were dying at a rate of 15 per day from heart attacks, strokes, and sheer exhaustion. While modern historians debate the accuracy of these death tolls, there is no question that the phenomenon was real and that it caused genuine suffering and fear throughout the community. The city authorities were at a complete loss for how to respond. They consulted with local physicians, who diagnosed the afflicted with something they called hot blood, a condition they believed could only be cured by more dancing. The logic, such as it was, held that the dancers needed to sweat out whatever malady had taken hold of them. Following this medical advice, the city council made a decision that would prove spectacularly misguided. They decided to encourage the dancing. Guild halls were opened and converted into dance halls. Professional musicians were hired to play around the clock. The city even brought in professional dancers to accompany the afflicted, believing that if they could just dance enough, they would eventually exhaust whatever force was compelling them. Strong men were recruited to hold up the dancers and keep them moving when their legs threatened to give out beneath them. The plan backfired catastrophically. Rather than burning itself out, the dancing plague spread even further. More and more citizens succumbed to the compulsion. The music that was supposed to provide relief seemed instead to fuel the frenzy. People who had come to watch or help the dancers found themselves suddenly overcome by the same irresistible urge. Panic set in across Strasbourg. The authorities, now convinced that something supernatural was at work, reversed course entirely. They banned public dancing and music. They closed down the temporary dance halls. They removed the afflicted dancers from the city and transported them to a mountaintop shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a Catholic saint believed to have the power to cure the dancing plague. There, the dancers were made to pray for forgiveness and absolution. By September, the epidemic had finally begun to subside. The dancing stopped as mysteriously as it had started. The surviving dancers gradually regained control of their bodies and resumed their normal lives. But the question of what had happened to them remained unanswered. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that must have seemed like something from a nightmare. The dancers moved without rhythm or grace, their bodies jerking and contorting in ways that seemed almost inhuman. Some howled like animals. Others made obscene gestures or stripped off their clothing as they danced. A few reportedly laughed or cried until they could do neither anymore, their voices giving out long before their legs did. The residents of Strasbourg who watched these scenes unfold must have wondered if they were witnessing the end of days, if God himself had decided to punish their city for some unknown transgression. The afflicted came from all walks of life. There were merchants and craftsmen, servants and laborers, men and women of all ages. Some accounts mention that the dancing seemed to strike the poor and the marginalized more frequently than the wealthy, though this could simply reflect the fact that the poor had fewer resources to escape or hide their condition. What is certain is that no social class was entirely immune. The dancing plague cut across the rigid hierarchies of medieval society with terrifying indifference. The dancing plague of 1518 was not an isolated incident. Similar outbreaks had occurred throughout medieval and Renaissance Europe, particularly along the Rhine and Moselle rivers. The earliest recorded dancing plague struck Aachen in 1374, just decades after the Black Death had killed roughly half the population of Europe. In that earlier outbreak, hundreds of people danced through the streets of various German towns, crossing rivers and borders as they moved from place to place. They too seemed unable to stop, and they too were eventually taken to religious shrines in hopes of finding a cure. Other outbreaks followed in the centuries that came after, including episodes in 1428 and 1463, though none were as well documented or as deadly as the one that struck Strasbourg. So what was happening to these people? Scientists and historians have proposed numerous theories over the centuries, but none has proven entirely satisfactory. Some suggested that the dancers had accidentally ingested ergot, a fungus that grows on damp rye and can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and other neurological symptoms. This theory, while intriguing, has largely been dismissed by modern researchers. Ergot poisoning typically causes severe vasoconstriction, which leads to gangrene of the extremities, a symptom that was notably absent from contemporary accounts of the dancing plague. Additionally, ergot was not a major food source in all the regions where dancing plagues occurred. The most widely accepted explanation today is that the dancing plague was a form of mass psychogenic illness, what earlier generations called mass hysteria. According to this theory, the extreme stress and trauma experienced by the people of Strasbourg, combined with their deeply held religious beliefs, created the perfect conditions for a collective psychological breakdown. The medical historian John Waller has argued convincingly that the dancers genuinely believed they had been cursed by Saint Vitus, and that this belief, combined with their desperation and fear, triggered a stress-induced dissociative trance state. In medieval Christian culture, it was widely believed that supernatural forces could cause people to dance against their will. Saint Vitus in particular was associated with this power, and festivals and cures connected to the saint were common throughout the region. When Frau Trophea began her strange dance, observers would have immediately understood it through this cultural lens. They would have believed that she had been cursed or possessed, and that belief, spreading through the community like a contagion of fear, may have made others susceptible to the same affliction. But even this explanation leaves questions unanswered. Why did the dancing plague strike when and where it did? Why were some people affected and not others? And perhaps most puzzling of all, why did it eventually stop? The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most baffling medical mysteries, a reminder that the human mind is capable of things that science still struggles to explain. Centuries later, and half a world away, another inexplicable outbreak would grip an entirely different community, proving that mass hysteria knows no boundaries of time or geography. The year was 1962, and the nation of Tanganyika had just celebrated its first months of independence from British colonial rule. Located on the eastern coast of Africa, this young country was filled with hope and uncertainty in equal measure. The people had endured decades of foreign domination, and now they faced the daunting task of building a new nation from the ground up. It was a time of tremendous change, and with change came stress, particularly for the younger generation who were being told that a brighter future awaited them, if only they worked hard enough. On January 30th, at a mission-run boarding school for girls in the village of Kashasha, near the western shore of Lake Victoria, something strange happened. 3 students began to laugh. There was nothing particularly funny happening at the time. No joke had been told. No amusing incident had occurred. The girls simply started laughing, and they could not stop. At first, the teachers paid little attention. Schoolgirls giggling was hardly unusual. But as the minutes stretched into hours and the hours stretched into days, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. The laughter was not the joyful, carefree sound of happy children. It was frantic, desperate, almost painful to hear. The affected girls would laugh until tears streamed down their faces, until their stomachs cramped, until they collapsed from exhaustion. And then, after a brief respite, the laughing would begin again. Within weeks, the strange affliction had spread to 95 of the school's 159 students. The teaching staff remained strangely unaffected, but the students were falling like dominoes. Along with the uncontrollable laughter came other symptoms that were anything but amusing. The girls suffered from fainting spells, difficulty breathing, rashes, and bouts of crying that were just as uncontrollable as their laughter. Some experienced pain throughout their bodies, Some ran aimlessly, as if fleeing from something only they could see. The school authorities were completely unprepared for what was happening. They tried everything they could think of to restore order, but nothing worked. The laughter spread from student to student like a virus, and by March 18th, the school was forced to close its doors. The girls were sent home to their families in villages scattered throughout the region. This decision, made with the best of intentions, turned out to be a terrible mistake. The affliction did not stay behind at the shuttered school. It followed the girls home. In April and May, the village of Nshamba, located about 55 miles west of Bukaba, experienced its own outbreak. 217 people, mostly young, fell victim to the laughing epidemic over the course of 34 days. The Kashasha school was actually sued by local authorities for allowing the contagion to spread into the surrounding communities. In June, another girls' school at Ramashenya was struck, with 48 students affected. Other schools and villages throughout the region reported cases as well. For 18 months, the laughter epidemic swept through the communities near Lake Victoria, affecting approximately 1,000 people and forcing 14 schools to close. The symptoms lasted anywhere from a few hours to 16 days in individual cases, with an average duration of about 7 days. The impact on daily life in the affected villages was profound. Work stopped. Businesses suffered. Families were thrown into chaos as parents tried to care for children who could not stop laughing and crying. The affected communities tried everything they could think of to stop the epidemic. Traditional healers were consulted. Prayers were offered. Some families isolated their affected members, hoping to prevent the condition from spreading to others. Nothing seemed to work. The laughter spread from person to person and village to village with a relentlessness that felt almost supernatural. Local health officials were at a loss. They had never encountered anything like this before. The affected individuals were not running fevers. They did not have infections. Their blood tests came back normal, yet clearly something was very wrong with them. The disconnect between the dramatic symptoms and the absence of any detectable physical cause was maddening for both the medical professionals and the suffering families. And then, as mysteriously as it had begun, the epidemic faded away. The laughter stopped. The schools reopened. Life returned to normal. But what had caused it? Medical professionals and scientists were as baffled as the local communities. The affected individuals showed no signs of viral or bacterial infection. Environmental toxins were ruled out. There was nothing physically wrong with the people who had been seized by uncontrollable laughter and its associated symptoms. The conclusion that most experts eventually reached was that the Tanganyika laughter epidemic was a case of mass psychogenic illness. The newly independent nation was going through a period of tremendous social upheaval. Students were under intense pressure to succeed academically, pressure that came from teachers, parents, and their own hopes for a better future. The rigid traditional culture they knew at home was clashing with the new ideas they were encountering at school. And in a society where young people, particularly young women, had little power or agency, the body may have found its own way to express the stress and anxiety that words could not convey. Christian Hempelmann, a researcher who has studied the epidemic extensively, has explained that mass psychogenic illness tends to occur in people without a lot of power. The body becomes a way of saying that something is wrong when other avenues of expression are blocked. The laughter, in this interpretation, was not a sign of happiness, but of distress, a physical manifestation of emotions that the girls had no other way to release. Yet questions remain. Why laughter? Why did the teaching staff remain unaffected? And why did the epidemic spread so efficiently from person to person and community to community? The Tanganyika laughter epidemic stands as one of the most thoroughly documented cases of mass psychogenic illness in history, and yet it still defies complete explanation. The pattern of inexplicable outbreaks affecting communities under stress would repeat itself again and again throughout the 20th century, sometimes taking forms that seemed ripped from the pages of science fiction. It was late summer in 1944, and the small city of Mattoon, Illinois, seemed like a world away from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, where the Second World War raged on. With a population of about 17,000, Mattoon was the kind of quiet Midwestern community where everyone knew their neighbors and crime was a rare occurrence. Many of the town's young men were away fighting overseas, leaving women to manage households and raise children alone. The war had brought both prosperity and anxiety to Mattoon, and the residents were doing their best to carry on with their daily lives. On the night of September 1st, Aline Kearney was home alone with her young daughter, Dorothy Ellen. Her husband, Bert, a taxi driver, was working his route, and her sister, Martha, was staying with her for company. It was a warm evening, and the windows of the modest house were open to catch whatever breeze might stir the summer air. Aline was lying in bed around 11 o'clock when she noticed an unusual smell drifting into the room. At first, she thought it might be coming from the flowers in the garden outside her window. But the odor quickly became stronger, a strange, sickeningly sweet scent that seemed to coat the inside of her mouth and throat. And then something terrifying happened. She tried to get out of bed and found that she could not move her legs. Aline called out in panic, alerting her sister. Martha rushed in and also noticed the peculiar smell. She determined that it seemed to be coming from the direction of the open bedroom window. The police were contacted, and when Bert Kearney returned home around 12:30 in the morning, he spotted a tall man dressed in dark clothing lurking near one of the house's windows. The stranger fled before Bert could catch him. By morning, news of the attack had spread through Mattoon. The local newspaper, the Daily Journal Gazette, ran a front-page story with the headline announcing that an anesthetic prowler was on the loose. The article described Aline's experience and warned residents to be on guard against this mysterious assailant who was apparently spraying some kind of paralyzing gas into people's homes. The story might have faded from the news if not for what happened next. More attacks were reported. Within days, dozens of Mattoon residents came forward claiming that they too had been victimized by the mysterious prowler. They described the same sickeningly sweet smell, the same temporary paralysis of the legs, the same feelings of nausea and weakness. Some claimed to have seen a tall, thin figure fleeing from their homes in the darkness. Others heard suspicious noises or found screens that appeared to have been tampered with. The reported attacks followed a disturbing pattern. They occurred almost exclusively at night, usually when the victims were alone or nearly alone in their homes. Women were disproportionately affected, particularly those whose husbands were away serving in the military. The gas, whatever it was, seemed to be sprayed through open windows or under doors. Victims reported feeling a strange sensation of warmth or tingling before the paralysis set in. Some experienced nausea, vomiting, or difficulty breathing. A few claimed to have suffered temporary blindness. The police took the report seriously, at least initially. Officers patrolled the streets of Mattoon after dark, looking for any sign of the mysterious attacker. They interviewed victims, collected what little physical evidence existed, and followed up on tips from concerned citizens. But despite their best efforts, they could not seem to catch the Mad Gasser in the act. He always seemed to be one step ahead, striking in one neighborhood while police were focused on another. The situation was made worse by the way the attacks seemed to escalate in severity. Early victims reported temporary paralysis and nausea. Later victims claimed to have suffered burns, welts, and other physical injuries. One woman said she had been so severely affected that she had to be hospitalized. Another claimed that she had been partially paralyzed for hours. Whether these escalating symptoms represented a genuine pattern or simply the power of suggestion taking hold is impossible to know for certain. The town erupted in panic. Armed vigilante groups began patrolling the streets at night, looking for any sign of the so-called Mad Gasser. The situation became so dangerous that the police chief had to issue a public warning telling citizens to disperse, noting that they were in grave danger of being shot by frightened property owners. Women refused to stay home alone. Businesses suffered as people were afraid to venture out after dark. The fear was palpable and all-consuming. The national media picked up the story. Time magazine ran an article about the mad anesthetist of Mattoon, describing him as a tall, thin man who wore a black skull cap and moved through the night as nimbly as a cat. Reporters descended on the small Illinois city, eager to cover what appeared to be one of the strangest crime sprees in American history. But despite the intensive investigation, police could find no concrete evidence that any attacks had actually occurred. There were no fingerprints, no physical traces of any chemical substance, and no consistent description of the attacker. Some victims reported seeing a man in dark clothes. Others saw nothing at all. The descriptions of the gas varied widely, as did the reported symptoms. On September 12th, the Mattoon police chief made a stunning announcement. After consulting with officials from a local war plant, he declared that the reported attacks were likely caused by industrial fumes being carried through the night air by shifting winds. Furthermore, he suggested that many of the reported incidents were the result of mass hysteria. There was no Mad Gasser, he proclaimed. The people of Mattoon had frightened themselves into believing in a phantom attacker. The announcement was met with outrage by some residents who insisted that their experiences were real. But it also had a curious effect. Almost immediately after the police chief declared the gasser to be a myth, the report stopped. The phantom attacker who had terrorized Mattoon for 2 weeks simply vanished, never to return. In the decades since, the Mad Gasser of Mattoon has become a textbook example of mass psychogenic illness. Social scientists point to the wartime anxiety, the power of suggestion amplified by sensational newspaper coverage, and the way fear can spread through a community like a contagion. The original incident involving Aline Kearney may have been nothing more than a momentary paralysis caused by anxiety or an overactive imagination, combined with a random smell that happened to drift through her window. But once the newspaper labeled it an attack and suggested that more would follow, the conditions were set for a classic outbreak of mass hysteria. Yet there are those who question this explanation. In 2003, a local high school teacher named Scott Maruna published a book arguing that there really was a Mad Gasser, a troubled local man with chemistry knowledge who had been seeking revenge against a town that had rejected him. Maruna pointed to physical evidence that he believed had been overlooked, including tampered window screens and eyewitness accounts that were too detailed to be mere fantasy. The debate continues to this day, a reminder that the line between mass hysteria and genuine mystery is not always clear. Just a few years earlier, a similar panic had gripped a town across the Atlantic Ocean, with consequences that proved to be even more tragic. November 1938 was a tense time in England. The Munich Agreement had been signed just 2 months earlier, and while Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had proclaimed peace for our time, most British citizens knew in their hearts that war with Nazi Germany was inevitable. The country was holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was sure to come. It was against this backdrop of national anxiety that the town of Halifax in West Yorkshire found itself gripped by terror. Halifax was an industrial town, home to textile mills and working-class families who had weathered the hardships of the Great Depression. The narrow streets and densely packed neighborhoods created a close-knit community where news traveled fast and rumors traveled even faster. When something strange happened on the evening of November 16th, word spread through Halifax like wildfire. 2 young women named Mary Gledhill and Gertrude Watts, both 21 years old, were walking home from work when they claimed to have been attacked by a mysterious man armed with a mallet. The assailant struck them on the head before disappearing into the thick November fog. The women rushed to a nearby house for help, blood streaming from wounds on their heads. The police were called, and a report was filed. 5 days later, another young woman named Mary Sutcliffe reported her own attack. She had been walking home from her job at a local toffee factory when a man stepped out of the shadows, raised his hand as if to strike her, and slashed her arm. She described her attacker as well-built, with a broad face, wearing lightweight shoes and what felt like a dirty Macintosh. The local newspaper, the Halifax Courier, seized upon the story. The paper announced a £10 reward for information leading to the arrest of the attacker, and in doing so, gave the mysterious assailant a name that would live in infamy: the Halifax Slasher. The effect on the community was immediate and dramatic. Reports of attacks poured into the police station. Victims described being slashed with knives or razors by a shadowy figure who seemed to materialize from the fog and vanish just as quickly. The descriptions of the attacker varied wildly, but the terror he inspired was universal. Vigilante groups formed on the streets of Halifax, armed with makeshift weapons and determined to catch the slasher. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Innocent men were mistaken for the attacker and beaten by angry mobs. One man was cornered and pinned against a wall by a crowd of 200 people calling for his blood. The police had to rescue him just in time. Businesses shut down. Women were afraid to leave their homes after dark. The panic spread beyond Halifax to nearby cities like Manchester and Bradford, where similar attacks were reported. The situation became so dire that Scotland Yard sent 2 detectives to Halifax to assist in the investigation. Newspapers drew comparisons between the Halifax Slasher and Jack the Ripper, the infamous serial killer who had terrorized London 50 years earlier. It seemed as though a genuine maniac was on the loose in West Yorkshire. And then the confessions began. On the evening of November 29th, a man named Percy Waddington walked into the Halifax police station. He had previously reported being attacked by the slasher, showing officers wounds on his body as proof. Now he had something different to tell them. He had made the whole thing up. The wounds were self-inflicted. There was no attacker. The confession must have stunned the police officers who received it. Here was a man who had played a significant role in fueling the town's panic, now admitting that he had invented his story entirely. But Waddington's confession was only the beginning. Over the following days, other supposed victims came forward with similar admissions. One woman confessed that she had cut herself in a fit of anger after a fight with her boyfriend, then blamed the slasher after reading about him in the newspapers. Another admitted that she had fabricated her story entirely. A man confessed that he had scratched himself and then claimed to have been attacked, perhaps seeking attention, or perhaps simply caught up in the hysteria that had gripped the town. Of the 12 reported victims, 9 eventually admitted that their attacks had never happened. Some had inflicted their own wounds. Others had misinterpreted innocent encounters in the dark as attacks. A few had simply made up stories out of whole cloth, perhaps for attention, perhaps to fit in with a community that seemed to expect everyone to have a slasher encounter. Scotland Yard concluded its investigation with a stunning finding. There had been no Halifax Slasher. The entire 2-week terror had been the product of collective imagination, fueled by newspaper coverage and the anxious atmosphere of pre-war Britain. 5 local residents were charged with public mischief for filing false reports. 4 of them were sentenced to prison time. The sentences were relatively light, as the court acknowledged that the defendants had been caught up in a mass delusion that had swept through the entire community. The Halifax Courier, which had done so much to stoke the panic, now sought to calm the community. The paper ran a story with the headline, "Carry on Halifax. The slasher scare is over." The theory of a half-crazed, wild-eyed man wandering around attacking helpless women was exploded, the article declared. But the damage had already been done. The Hysteria claimed at least one victim who received no justice and no closure. Michael McKeevan was a 46-year-old man who struggled with mental health issues. When his co-workers began to suspect him of being the Halifax Slasher, the pressure became unbearable. Michael McKeevan died by suicide, taking an overdose of aspirin. He was the only confirmed fatality of the Halifax Slasher panic, killed not by a phantom attacker, but by the fear and suspicion of his own community. Some investigators believe that the very first attack on Mary Sutcliffe may have been genuine. It happened before the media frenzy truly ignited, and before the copycat reports began flooding in. If there was a real attacker, his single crime may have been buried beneath an avalanche of hoaxes and hysteria, his existence erased by the very panic he accidentally triggered. The Halifax Slasher case is studied today as a textbook example of mass sociogenic illness, demonstrating how fear can spread through a community and cause people to harm themselves and each other in pursuit of a threat that does not exist. But it also serves as a sobering reminder that the consequences of mass hysteria are all too real, even when the threat itself is imaginary. The pattern of communities creating their own monsters would continue in the years that followed, sometimes taking forms that seemed almost absurd in hindsight. The spring of 1954 found the United States in the grip of Cold War anxiety. The Soviet Union had tested its first hydrogen bomb just months earlier, and Americans were increasingly worried about the threat of nuclear attack. Civil defense drills were common. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. The specter of atomic annihilation hung over everything. It was in this atmosphere of fear that residents of Bellingham, Washington began noticing something strange about their car windshields. Small pits and dings seemed to be appearing overnight, as if something was eating away at the glass. At first, local police assumed the damage was the work of vandals armed with BB guns. But as reports multiplied and spread to nearby towns like Sedro-Woolley and Mount Vernon, a more sinister explanation began to take hold. By mid-April, the so-called pitting epidemic had reached metropolitan Seattle. Newspapers carried breathless front-page stories about the mysterious damage appearing on windshields throughout the Puget Sound region. Frightened motorists stopped police cars on the street to report that their vehicles had been hit. Parking lots and car dealerships reported damage to dozens, then hundreds of vehicles. The situation escalated so rapidly that Seattle's mayor, Alan Pomeroy, sent urgent telegrams to both the governor of Washington and President Dwight Eisenhower, begging for federal assistance in solving the mystery. Theories about the cause of the pitting multiplied as quickly as the reports themselves. Some blamed cosmic rays streaming down from space. Others pointed to sand fleas that had supposedly laid eggs in the glass, the eggs hatching and somehow damaging the windshields from within. A newly constructed radio transmitter in the Seattle area was accused of emitting waves that caused the windshields to oscillate and crack. Someone even suggested that supernatural forces were at work, that the pitting was a sign of divine displeasure. But the most popular theory, and the most terrifying, was that the pitting was caused by radioactive fallout from H-bomb tests conducted in the Pacific. In the nuclear-anxious atmosphere of 1954, this explanation resonated deeply with the public. The fear was palpable. Car owners covered their vehicles with tarps and blankets, hoping to protect them from whatever invisible force was attacking the glass. Auto dealerships reported that customers were reluctant to buy new cars, afraid that their investment would be damaged within days. Some residents claimed that the pitting was spreading to their house windows as well, though these reports were never substantiated. The situation had all the hallmarks of a community in the grip of genuine terror. The University of Washington assembled a committee of scientists to investigate the phenomenon. They examined dozens of windshields, tested for radiation, and analyzed the mysterious pits under microscopes. Law enforcement officials scrutinized the windshields of 15,000 cars, finding that more than 3,000 showed signs of damage. The investigation was thorough and methodical, driven by genuine concern for public safety. The investigation ultimately reached a conclusion that must have been deeply anticlimactic for the terrified residents of Seattle. There was no mysterious pitting agent. The marks on the windshields were perfectly ordinary road damage, the kind that accumulates gradually on any vehicle that is driven regularly. Bits of gravel kicked up by passing traffic, sand particles carried by the wind, and the normal wear and tear of daily use had created the small pits and dings that residents were now noticing for the first time. Sergeant Max Allison of the Seattle Police Crime Laboratory delivered the verdict bluntly. The reports were composed of 5% hoodlumism and 95% public hysteria. The citizens of Seattle, primed by their fears of atomic attack and encouraged by sensational media coverage, had simply started looking at their windshields instead of through them. They saw damage that had always been there and assumed it must be new and sinister. By April 17th, just days after the panic had reached its peak, reports of pitting abruptly ceased. The epidemic had burned itself out as quickly as it had begun. The Seattle windshield pitting epidemic became a textbook example of collective delusion, cited in psychology courses alongside other famous cases of mass hysteria. It demonstrated how powerful the combination of ambient fear, media amplification, and social reinforcement could be in creating a crisis out of nothing. The phenomenon illustrated something important about how human perception works. Under normal circumstances, we look through our windshields without really seeing them. But once the newspapers suggested that something was attacking the glass, people began examining their windshields with new attention. They found what they expected to find: evidence of damage. And because everyone was finding damage at the same time, it seemed to confirm that something unusual was happening. The Seattle episode was relatively harmless, causing mainly embarrassment and a few days of unnecessary anxiety. But other outbreaks of mass hysteria would prove far more destructive, particularly when they occurred in communities already stressed by poverty and hardship. The summer of 2001 was punishing in New Delhi, India. Temperatures soared above 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and the thick, humid air made every breath feel like swallowing soup. To make matters worse, the city was plagued by rolling blackouts that plunged neighborhoods into darkness for hours at a time. Residents of the poorer areas, who could not afford backup generators, were forced to sleep on their rooftops to escape the suffocating heat of their homes. It was under these conditions of extreme stress and discomfort that a monster was born from the collective imagination of 13 million people. The first reports emerged in early May. People in the eastern neighborhoods of Delhi claimed to have been attacked during the night by a strange creature. The descriptions varied wildly. Some said it was a monkey-like figure covered in thick black hair. Others described it as more humanoid, wearing a metal helmet and possessing glowing red eyes. Some claimed it had metal claws that it used to scratch and bite its victims. Others said it wore some kind of suit with 3 buttons on its chest. The creature was given a name, the Kala Bandar, or Monkey Man. As word of the attack spread through Delhi's crowded neighborhoods, panic took hold. People claimed to have been scratched, bitten, and chased by the Monkey Man as it leaped from rooftop to rooftop in the darkness. The police were flooded with calls. Between May 10th and May 25th, nearly 400 people contacted the police control room to report being attacked by the mysterious creature. The fear that gripped Delhi during those 2 weeks was all-consuming. Neighborhoods formed vigilante groups that patrolled the streets with clubs, knives, and anything else that could serve as a weapon. The vigilantes were determined to catch the Monkey Man, and in their terror, they became dangerous themselves. A van driver was chased by a mob that believed him to be the creature. They dragged him from his vehicle and beat him so severely that he was hospitalized with multiple fractures. A 4-foot-tall Hindu holy man, wandering through a neighborhood at night, was mistaken for the Monkey Man and attacked by an angry crowd. The real tragedy came in the form of deaths. A pregnant woman, hearing neighbors shout that the Monkey Man had been spotted, fell down a flight of stairs while fleeing. She did not survive. A man, convinced that the creature was chasing him, leaped from his rooftop and fell to his death. The exact number of casualties attributed to the Monkey Man panic varies by source, but at least 2 people died not from any attack by a monster, but from the fear of one. The Delhi police took the threat seriously, at least initially. They released artists' sketches based on eyewitness descriptions, though the sketches depicted wildly different creatures. They announced a reward of 50,000 rupees for information leading to the capture of the Monkey Man. They deployed extra patrols throughout the affected neighborhoods. But investigators from the Indian Rationalist Association, led by Sanal Edamaraku, were already reaching different conclusions. Edamaraku and his colleagues went into the affected areas and interviewed dozens of people who claimed to have seen or been attacked by the Monkey Man. What they found was revealing. The descriptions were hopelessly inconsistent. The injuries that victims displayed were minor scratches and bruises, the kind that could easily result from accidentally bumping into something in the dark. Many of the attacks had occurred during power outages, when people could not see what had startled them. Edamaraku concluded that the Monkey Man was a product of mass hysteria, fueled by the extreme stress of the heat wave, the anxiety created by the power outages, and the rapid spread of rumors through a dense, crowded city. The creature's connection to Hanuman, the Hindu monkey god, may have made the idea of a monkey-like attacker more culturally resonant for Delhi's predominantly Hindu population. Once the idea took hold, people began interpreting ordinary nighttime sounds and shadows as evidence of the monster's presence. On May 21st, Delhi police officially announced that the monkey man was neither man nor monkey, but a result of public hysteria. The reports quickly tapered off and eventually stopped altogether. The monkey man had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. But the incident left scars on Delhi, both physical and psychological. The deaths of innocent people, the injuries inflicted by vigilante violence, and the 2 weeks of terror all demonstrated the power of collective fear to create genuine harm. The monkey man was a phantom, but the suffering he caused was real. The pattern of mass hysteria affecting young people in school settings has proven to be one of the most persistent and puzzling forms of the phenomenon, and it would manifest again in the 21st century in ways that challenged our understanding of how these events spread. The small town of Leroy, New York, sits in the western part of the state, about 30 miles southwest of Rochester. With a population of about 7,500, it is the kind of quiet, tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone and major news is rare. The town is perhaps best known as the birthplace of Jell-O gelatin, a claim to fame that speaks to its unassuming character. Life in Leroy moves at a slower pace than in the nearby cities, and that is exactly how most residents like it. In the fall of 2011, something happened in Leroy that would make headlines around the world and baffle medical experts for months. It started with Katie Krautwurst, a cheerleader at Leroy Junior-Senior High School. One day in October, she woke up from a nap and immediately knew something was wrong. Her face began to contract in spasms. Her chin jutted forward involuntarily. She was experiencing what appeared to be the symptoms of Tourette's syndrome, the neurological condition characterized by repetitive, involuntary movements and vocalizations called tics. Katie had not shown any symptoms before that afternoon. She had no family history of Tourette's or other movement disorders. She had not suffered any head injury or illness that might explain what was happening to her. The tics had appeared suddenly and without warning, as if a switch had been flipped inside her brain. Her parents were terrified. Doctors were perplexed. Katie herself was confused and frightened, unable to control her own body. Within weeks, Katie's best friend, Thera Sanchez, the captain of the cheerleading squad, woke up with the same symptoms. Her head jerked uncontrollably. Her arms flailed. She developed a stutter. Then another girl was affected, and another. The symptoms seemed to be spreading through the student body like a contagion, though medical tests revealed no virus or bacteria that could explain the transmission. The affected students shared certain characteristics. Most were high-achieving, socially connected young women who were active in school activities like cheerleading, sports, and drama. Many had experienced significant stress in their lives, ranging from family problems to academic pressures to the normal turbulence of adolescence. But these characteristics described countless teenagers who never developed tics, so they could not fully explain what was happening in Leroy. By early 2012, 18 people in Leroy had developed the mysterious tic-like symptoms. 14 teenage girls, 1 teenage boy, and a 36-year-old woman who had no direct connection to the school but had followed the case on social media. The woman's case was particularly puzzling. She had never met the affected students. She lived miles from the school. Her only connection to the outbreak was that she had watched news coverage of it obsessively and had engaged with affected students and their families on Facebook. The national media descended on Leroy. The story had all the elements of a compelling mystery. innocent teenage girls struck down by an inexplicable illness, a small town searching for answers, and the possibility that environmental contamination might be to blame. The affected students appeared on major news programs, their involuntary movements and vocalizations on full display. Footage of the girls struggling with their symptoms spread across the internet. Environmental activist Erin Brockovich, famous for her role in exposing groundwater contamination in California, heard about the Leroy case and sent investigators to the town. They focused on a toxic spill that had occurred decades earlier when a train derailment released thousands of gallons of hazardous chemicals into the ground just a few miles from the school. Could those chemicals, still lurking in the soil and water, be responsible for the students' condition? The investigation was extensive. The New York State Department of Health tested the school's air and water quality. Environmental scientists searched for any evidence of contamination that could explain the symptoms. Medical experts examined the affected students, looking for any common factor that might point to a physical cause. What they found was nothing. No environmental toxin that could cause tics. No infectious agent spreading through the school. No physical abnormality in the brains of the affected students. The tests came back clean. In January 2012, the doctors treating most of the students announced their diagnosis: conversion disorder, a condition in which psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms. The outbreak, they concluded, was a case of mass psychogenic illness. The students were not faking their symptoms. Their tics were real and involuntary, but the cause was psychological rather than neurological. The diagnosis was met with anger and denial by many of the parents. They could not accept that their daughter's dramatic, debilitating symptoms were essentially all in their heads. Some sought alternative explanations and treatments. The controversy became nearly as intense as the outbreak itself. But doctors noticed something interesting. The students who stayed out of the media spotlight tended to get better. The students who continued to appear on television and share their stories online tended to remain symptomatic. When the school year ended and the students were separated from each other and from the constant attention of reporters and cameramen, many of them recovered completely. The Leroy case demonstrated something that researchers had long suspected. Mass psychogenic illness could be spread and amplified by media coverage. The more attention the outbreak received, the more severe the symptoms became. The 24-hour news cycle and the rise of social media had created new vectors for the spread of psychogenic symptoms, vectors that did not require physical proximity between the affected individuals. This insight would prove prophetic when, less than a decade later, a new form of mass psychogenic illness emerged that was spread almost entirely through the internet. The COVID-19 pandemic that swept the world in 2020 created conditions of stress, isolation, and anxiety, unlike anything most people had experienced in their lifetimes. Schools closed. Social gatherings were banned. Teenagers who should have been navigating the normal challenges of adolescence instead found themselves confined to their homes, cut off from their friends, and spending unprecedented amounts of time on social media. It was during this period that doctors around the world began noticing a strange trend. Young people, predominantly teenage girls, were arriving at neurology clinics with sudden onset tics. They exhibited the same kinds of involuntary movements and vocalizations seen in Tourette syndrome, but their symptoms did not match the typical presentation of that disorder. Tourette's usually appears in early childhood, not adolescence. It develops gradually rather than suddenly, and it rarely causes the severe, dramatic symptoms that these patients were displaying. When doctors began interviewing these patients about their backgrounds and habits, a common thread emerged. Virtually all of them had spent hours watching TikTok videos of people who claimed to have Tourette syndrome. The Tourette's hashtag had accumulated billions of views on the platform, driven largely by influencers who documented their daily lives with the condition. Many of these videos presented Tourette's in a lighthearted, almost entertaining way, showing the amusing or embarrassing moments that the condition could cause. The doctors began to suspect that they were witnessing a new form of mass psychogenic illness, one that was being spread not through physical contact, but through social media exposure. They gave it a name: TikTok tics. Research published in medical journals documented the phenomenon in detail. The patients were typically teenage girls who had watched extensive Tourette-related content during the pandemic lockdowns. Their symptoms often matched the specific tics displayed by the influencers they followed, right down to the exact words and phrases they involuntarily shouted. In Germany, multiple patients developed tics identical to those of a popular German YouTuber with Tourette syndrome, including the involuntary utterance of specific German phrases. The mechanism appeared similar to other forms of mass psychogenic illness. Young people who were already stressed, anxious, and isolated found a community online among those who shared their struggles. The influencers they watched became role models of a sort, people who had found a way to turn a difficult condition into something relatable and even entertaining. In the suggestible state created by pandemic anxiety, some viewers began unconsciously mimicking the symptoms they saw on screen. The phenomenon was documented across multiple countries simultaneously. In Germany, researchers at Hanover Medical School reported treating numerous teenagers with sudden onset tics that were identical to those displayed by a popular German YouTuber named Jan Zimmermann, who documents his life with Tourette syndrome under the channel name Gewitter im Kopf. In Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States, similar cases emerged. The condition was spreading not through air or water or physical contact, but through the fiber optic cables and wireless signals that carried TikTok videos from creator to viewer. One of the most striking aspects of the TikTok tics phenomenon was the specificity of the symptoms. Many affected individuals did not just develop generic tics. They developed the exact same tics as the influencers they followed, including specific words, phrases, and gestures. Some would involuntarily shout phrases like beans or beetroot, or "I am a silly goose," the same phrases used by the influencers they had been watching. This specificity strongly suggested that the symptoms were being learned rather than arising spontaneously. Unlike Tourette syndrome, which is a lifelong neurological condition, the TikTok tics proved to be treatable. Patients who were told firmly that they did not have Tourette's, who were encouraged to stay away from tic-related content, and who received treatment for underlying anxiety often recovered within weeks or months. The symptoms were real, but their origin was psychological rather than neurological. Doctors found that one of the most effective treatments was simply telling patients the truth about their condition. When young people were informed that they did not have Tourette syndrome, that their symptoms were functional rather than organic, and that recovery was possible and even expected, many of them improved dramatically. The power of belief, which had helped create the symptoms in the first place, could also help resolve them. The TikTok tics phenomenon represented something new in the history of mass psychogenic illness. For the first time, an outbreak had spread among people who had never met each other in person, linked only by their shared consumption of social media content. The traditional model of hysteria spreading through physical proximity in schools, factories, or communities had to be expanded to include digital proximity as well. Some researchers have coined the term mass social media-induced illness to describe this new variant of an old phenomenon, They warn that as social media becomes ever more pervasive in young people's lives, similar outbreaks may become more common. The algorithm-driven nature of platforms like TikTok, which serve users more of whatever content they engage with, could create feedback loops that amplify and spread psychogenic symptoms with unprecedented efficiency. The study of mass hysteria forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human mind. We like to believe that we are rational creatures, that our perceptions are reliable, and that our bodies respond only to genuine threats. But the evidence of centuries shows otherwise. Under the right conditions, ordinary people can be seized by compulsions they cannot control, plagued by symptoms that have no physical cause, and terrorized by monsters that exist only in the collective imagination. What makes these events so disturbing is not just their mystery, but their reality. The people who danced themselves to exhaustion in medieval Strasbourg were not pretending. The girls who laughed uncontrollably in Tanzania were genuinely suffering. The victims of the Mad Gasser, the Halifax Slasher, and the Monkey Man experienced real fear, and some paid for it with their lives or their health. Mass hysteria is not a hoax or a delusion. It is a documented psychological phenomenon with measurable effects on real people. And perhaps most troubling of all, it could happen to any of us. The conditions that give rise to mass psychogenic illness, stress, uncertainty, social pressure, and exposure to frightening ideas are not unusual. They are part of normal human life. Most of the time, most of us cope with these pressures without falling victim to collective delusion. But under the right circumstances, any community could find itself in the grip of fears that feed upon themselves and grow stronger with each passing day. The cases we have explored tonight span more than 500 years of human history, from medieval Europe to the social media age. They have occurred in wealthy nations and poor ones, in cities and small towns, among the educated and the uneducated. They have taken forms as different as uncontrollable dancing, inexplicable laughter, phantom attackers, mysterious illnesses, and invisible threats. Yet they share common threads: communities under stress, fears that spread from person to person, and symptoms that defy easy medical explanation. Science has made progress in understanding mass hysteria. We know that it tends to affect people who lack power or agency. We know that media coverage can amplify and spread it. We know that it often resolves when the affected individuals are removed from the environment that triggered their symptoms and reassured that they are not truly ill. But we still cannot predict when or where the next outbreak will occur, or what form it will take. The human mind remains in many ways a mystery, capable of wonders and horrors that we are only beginning to understand. The dancing plagues, the laughter epidemics, the phantom attackers, and the digital contagions remind us that beneath the thin veneer of rationality, we remain creatures of instinct and emotion, vulnerable to fears that can spread like wildfire and consume us from within. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mysterious world of mass hysteria, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the strangest and most puzzling corners of human history. Sweet dreams.